We're in East Brighton, Melbourne, Australia. It's the 9th of June 1997. The survivor is Felix Flikier. My name is Christian Furliker. What's your name?
My name is Felix Flikier.
Please spell that.
Felix Flicker.
Is this your name at birth?
Yes.
Was it spelt that way at birth?
In Poland, it was spelled slightly different. Would you like me to spell it to you? Felikes Flikier.
When are you born?
On the 6th of June 1925.
Where?
In a town called Białystok.
Where is this?
It's on the east of Poland, eastern part of Poland.
How old are you today?
72.
Tell us about your mother.
My mother's name was Rebecca. She was the typical Jewish mother, only involved with her family. She had very few outside interests. The well-being of the family was her main aim. Her maiden name was Kartoflewicz. She was also born in Białystok. In her young years, she was a seamstress, or these days they would call it a machine operator. She was very capable in this field, and thanks to these abilities, I'll tell you how later on it saved our life.
Describe her physical appearance.
My mother's. Naturally, to me, she was the most beautiful woman in the world. She was a very good-looking person. Dressed nicely, because we were a middle-class family and she could afford some nice clothing.
How was her character like?
She was not temperamental, she was very reserved. With the children and husband, she always spoke in a quite nice manner, never lost her temper, never punished the children physically. But a few stern words now and again did the trick.
What language did she speak to you?
Yiddish. Our language at home was Yiddish.
Tell us about your father.
My father, again to me, he was the most wonderful father in the world. He had some secondary education when Białystok still was part of Russia before the First World War. And it was not very common for Jewish youngsters to have some secular education. But my grandfather wanted the best for him, so he did finish a gymnasium, and Russian was his other native language after Yiddish. My father was engaged in the edible oil industry. With a few partners, they were running a plant of extraction of edible oils. And he was very good at that, particularly in the department of sales. He had a similar nature as my mother. He was quite spoken, he never screamed, never punished us physically, but a stern word was good enough for the children to conform to the wishes of the parents.
What was his name?
My father's name was David, and he was the only son and had 2 sisters.
How religious were your parents?
To try to use modern terminology, they were more traditional than religious. But out of respect to the grandparents, which were much more religious, I would go, and my brother, when he grew up, we would go every Saturday morning for morning service in a small synagogue, and naturally all the Jewish holidays were observed. We ran a kosher kitchen at home, which was the case with, I would say, at least 95% of Jewish families in Poland. But in other ways, my father was fairly modern. He would ride on a Saturday and a Shabbat. He would smoke a cigarette on the quiet, but never do anything like that in front of his parents, out of respect. I even remember as a child a very interesting incident. We lived on the 1st floor, and at home we were not wearing any head covers, we were bareheaded. But when my father, during a meal, would hear the footsteps of his father coming up, he would call out, "Rebecca, quickly, give me my hat and the children's hat, because father is coming." It was the type of respect that you find very seldom these days.
Tell us about your brothers and sisters.
I have one brother, Harry, 2 years younger than me, born in 1927. He attended the same school as me. He was also a very bright youngster, very good with his hands, could fix things at home even at the age of 9 and 10. My sister, which was 4 years younger than me, also attended a special girls' school. Was a nice, bright kid. Singing, dancing was her specialty.
What's her name?
My sister's name is Keila, K-E-I-L-A. It's after my maternal grandmother. My brother's name is Harry, as I mentioned.
Take us through your house in Białystok.
For the size of a city like Białystok, we were living under quite modern conditions. We had a 2-story place, ground floor, lounge, dining room and kitchen. 1st floor, the bedrooms. We were about, I would say, we belonged to about 10% of the population of Białystok that had running water and internal toilets and even a kind of hot water system. It was not too common yet at these times. Our house was nicely furnished in the style of these years. The 2 boys had 1 bedroom. The girl had her own bedroom. My parents had their bedroom. In our lunchroom, we had, being people that read a lot, we had a big bookcase filled with books in mostly Polish language, but also some in Yiddish and Hebrew. Is there anything else you would like to know?
What was the street address?
We lived under the number of 53, and the name of the street was Suraska, which I'll have to spell to you again. Surazska. It got no particular meaning, but that was the name of the street.
What were some of your interests and hobbies before the war?
You realize that before the war, when the war started, actually I was only 14 years old. So I can mention interests and hobbies of a youngster of this age. I liked very much reading. Once a week to go to the movies was a great thing. I would never miss it. I participated in the work of a Zionist youth organization. We used to meet once a week, have discussions, sing-alongs, sometimes in summer even a fire and something like the modern barbecue. I was interested in world politics, and I can honestly say that at the age of 13 and 14, most probably I was so knowledgeable as youngsters in their 18s, 19s and 20s these days.
What books did you read?
I liked history books and I liked detective stories. And already when I grew a little bit older, I enjoyed a nice love story. But basically, the light type of reading, except if we had some compulsory reading from school, which usually was connected with history, Polish history. I used to read that.
What are some of the authors you remember?
I remember very well the famous Polish author Sienkiewicz, which wrote a very famous trilogy. I was very familiar with it. I actually read it a few times. Another Polish author, Bolesław Prus, which was famous for his novel called The Pharaoh, describing ancient Egypt. And at the years when we did not have any television and just radio began coming up, the book was the main source of information. And I was very, very taken on with the historical novel of his called Pharaoh. And also, the name I mentioned, Sienkiewicz, wrote a novel by the name of Quo Vadis. On this novel, later on, the film Quo Vadis was based. It was on the persecution of the early Christians by the Romans.
What newspapers and magazines did your family have?
My father was subscribing to a daily Yiddish newspaper by the name of Heint, which in translation meant today. It was a Zionist-oriented newspaper, and I was buying some special editions of magazines and newspapers for students of a nature of travelogues, history, geography, connected. But the normal daily newspaper was the one I mentioned before, in Yiddish.
Tell us about the films you saw at the local cinema.
The films I enjoyed mostly were westerns. And I remember even the names of the famous actors at this age. It was Tom Mix was one of the famous ones, westerns. And occasionally historical subjects. And I remember very well, just before the war started, one of the old cinemas was rebuilt, modernized, and for the opening night they had the color, filming colors already, The King and the Pauper. That was one of my favorites, I would say, the favorite.
Why did you enjoy going to the movies so much?
Because the movies was one of the, I would say, the only venue of entertainment. I used also to go to theater when they used to put on some Yiddish plays, but that would be 2 or 3 times per year. Where to the movies Saturday afternoon was a regular event.
How much did it cost to get in?
It used to cost 25 groszy. It would be the equivalent of about 25 cents these days. But for this money you could buy about 2 loaves of bread or a dozen bread rolls, or even 200 grams of sausage or something. But it was a special price for school children for matinees. At night time it used to cost more.
How wealthy was your family?
I would classify myself in the medium to well class, not a class of millionaires, but very comfortable. And my parents never saved anything for the comfort of the children. We used to go for summer holidays. We used to have a summer, used to be called a dacha, like a summer house. It was not our own. We used to rent it every summer. And once we traveled with my parents to the seaside. It was a great event. We were well dressed. We were well fed. If it used to be a rainy day, we would go to school by fiaker. It's a horse-drawn carriage. My parents always bought us the books we asked for, the clothing we asked for. And I would say it was quite a comfortable middle-class living.
Did your family have a car?
No, this car, at this time, I think Białystok, a town of 100,000 inhabitants, must have had about 20 cars. 10 of them taxis, and 10 belonged to the very wealthy ones that could afford a chauffeur, because it wasn't such a thing that you drive your own car. It had to be driven by a driver, by a chauffeur.
What education did you have before the war?
Before the war, I finished primary and did 2 years of secondary in a Hebrew gymnasium. I mentioned it specially Hebrew because that was a unique school where all subjects were taught in the Hebrew language. And the generation of pupils were being prepared to continue their studies in Palestine at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at the Technical College in Haifa. There were only about 3 gymnasiums of this type in the whole of Poland. And not to forget that the Jewish population of Poland was 3.3 million. It was a private school, the tuition fees were fairly high, but my parents never tried to economize on our education.
What were your dreams and aspirations?
Dreams and aspirations were, after graduating, to continue my studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I wanted to become a surgeon. But, naturally, the war changed all these plans.
What examples of anti-Semitism, if any, do you recall at school?
At school we never had any anti-Semitism because it was a purely Jewish students. But in general, personally, I encountered only one case of anti-Semitism. Saturday afternoon we used to go for our regular walk to look at the stores, to enjoy some of the special sweets. And I remember a case of two Polish students that passed by and one slapped me in the face with a kind of a laughter and saying the word, "You Jew." But personally, that was the only case of anti-Semitism I experienced. In our town of 100,000, 60,000 Jews lived. The majority of the population was Jewish. And the center of the town, I would say about 90% of the inhabitants were Jewish, because the Polish population lived mostly in the outside areas, like in the further suburbs, you would call it these days.
What professions did Jews engage in predominantly?
At this time, now, Jews were very well, I'm just looking for the right, a great number of Jews were engaged in the professions of lawyers, medicine, doctors of different fields, and I would say that in our town 95% of the medical practitioners were Jewish, and also engaged greatly in manufacturing. Our city was very famous as a great textile manufacturing center. And in other types of business, like there were some butchers and grocers and bakers, but mostly in the professions and manufacturing.
Where did your family do their shopping?
Those were the days before supermarkets that didn't exist. So my mother had her regular suppliers, like butchers, grocers, dairy produce, fruit. Part of it, she used to go, we lived very near the city market. And to be able to get the best quality of vegetables and dairy produce, the market was the place, because they were bringing it daily from the villages around. But grocery, she had her local grocer, bakery was the local one, and she had her butcher, and the fish supply, because Friday was the day for fish.
Would she buy from Jews and Christians alike?
As far as meat is concerned, naturally it was a Jewish butcher, the grocer was Jewish, and the baker was Jewish. But the dairy produce and vegetables were from the non-Jewish peasants that used to come and bring the produce to the market.
How could people tell at the time who was Jew and who was Christian?
It's very hard to say because it's not like these days where youngsters are dressed the same way and grown-ups are dressed the same way. Somehow, I don't know how to explain it, but you could, by seeing a person and speaking to a person, in 9 out of 10 cases, you would make the right judgment if he's Jewish or non-Jewish.
Why?
Firstly, the accent. Most of Jewish people were brought up in a Yiddish-speaking environment. The Polish language was the language that was taught at school and used in daily life. But you still could pick out the Polish spoken by a Jewish person and the Polish spoken by a Polish person. I suppose the same applies these days to people that were not born in Australia. You can pick out the slight accent. In my case, I'm 50 years here already, and still people pick out, will always ask me, where actually were you born?
What are some of the names of prominent Jewish figures in Białystok before the war that you remember from the time?
One of the most prominent figures was Dr. Zamenhof. He was the originator of the Esperanto international language. He was actually a world-famous figure. Then we had our famous personalities like the famous medical practitioner Dr. Hazanovich. We had a very famous paramedic, which these days they were doing much more than the paramedics at our time. It was Dr. Osder. A few famous rabbis, one of them the grandfather of my wife, Rabbi Bishkovich, and a few very well-known industrialist manufacturers. My father was one of them. A few engaged in the textile industry like Sokol and Silberpfennig, the Pines families, the Marraine family that were engaged in tannery leather production. In the field of education, there was Dr. Adler, which was a very famous teacher of Polish language. We had a very famous teacher of arts and crafts. Jakubowicz was his name. There were a number of other well-known teachers, but more or less I gave you the names of a few famous personalities.
We have to change the tape. Felix Flikier. How much of a patriot were you before the war?
Very patriotic. I liked Poland. I liked the Polish culture, Polish language, Polish literature. And I felt if I would be older, I would be very happy to serve in the Polish army.
How much trust did you have in the Polish army?
We have been of the opinion that the Polish army is very modern and very strong. That's what we used to hear over the radio and read in the press, and the speeches of the president and the army commanders. But regretfully, when the war started, the Polish army has shown itself years and years behind the modern armies of the day.
How much did you know about the anti-Semitism of the Germans?
I can recollect that in 1933, when Hitler became the ruler of Germany, a lot of it has been written up in the press, over the radio. We knew about the famous book Mein Kampf that Hitler has written, and the Jewish population started to boycott German manufactured goods. Jewish merchants that had business dealings with German companies stopped dealing with them. We knew that Jews in Germany are being persecuted in some degree. But how it turned out later, nobody had the slightest idea that anything like that can happen with a nation that was considered one of the most progressive, one of the most educated and cultural nations in Europe.
How much did you fear the war?
To be truthful, at my age, I thought it might be a very interesting experience. Being a child, I did not realize what actually war means, what it can bring. But it was a kind of a mixture of fear and curiosity, how it's going to turn out, how it's going to look. We never ever thought how tragic the results of a war might turn out.
When did the war start for you?
The war started on the first early morning hours of the 1st of September 1939.
How old were you then?
I was then 14 years old.
What happened on that day to you and your family?
It's a very memorable day because on the 1st of September, the summer school holidays are finished and schooling begins. We knew that something is going on, that it might happen something unusual, because in the end of August, Hitler had the famous non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, with Molotov, the so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov pact. We knew that something is behind it, but we never thought it's going to happen so quickly. And when we found it out is when we could hear the sirens blaring, and on the first day of the war we already had some German planes over our city, and the railway yards were bombed. Most of us had their basements in the houses, because the basement was a kind of a pantry for perishable foods. So we had organized some bedding, some dishes to keep water and food in case of a alarm, in case of a bombardment. But our city was bombarded only twice, and it was confined to the railway yards. But over the radio and in the press, we could read between the lines that things are moving bad for Poland. Also, nobody admits that they are losing. It was a case of they have to reorganize, etc. But the BBC that had the audition in Polish was giving us a more truthful picture, and we could see that Poland is going to collapse very quickly.
What happened to Białystok?
It didn't suffer from any air bombardments, but on the 17th of September, the German troops entered Białystok. There was no battle for the town because the Polish army was already so disorganized. They were on the run, and the Germans just had to march in. And we've seen the first German troops on the 17th of September. The first few days of their behavior was reasonably normal. We could see some food kitchens on the streets handing out food to the army, and even some children used to come over. They used to fill up some dishes with food for them. We could not see any particular anti-Jewish actions from the German army then. It was a curfew for all the inhabitants. From 6 in the morning till 7 in the evening was only allowed to walk the streets. After that we had to sit home. We heard about 1 or 2 cases where Germans shoot a couple of Jews. But that was about all. There was no specific anti-Jewish movement and anti-Jewish actions.
Tell us about that 1 or 2 instances.
We knew very little about it. There were no witnesses to say exactly what happened. It was just that we heard that a Jew by the name of so-and-so and another one were shot by the Germans. We don't know the particular reasons, we don't know the circumstances. That's all we knew about it. Later on, we realized why they behaved the way they did. Because after 7 days of occupation of the town by the German army, one morning we had some movement of military vehicles, of tanks, of lorries, and we have seen the German army turning west, in other words, leaving Białystok. And simultaneously, we have seen the soldiers of the Russian army coming into town with their artillery, with some tanks, and we realized then that most probably in the plan of division of Poland, Białystok will become part of the Soviet Union. And that's exactly what had happened. After the Red Army entered Białystok, the following day we had the great news that we're becoming part now of Belarus. That's the republic that was closest to Poland. And we were liberated from the Polish, I'm just trying to think about the words the Russians used, the capitalists that were riding on the backs of the working class, the bloodsuckers of the working class, that we now become part of the happy nation of the Soviet Union. There are no fears anymore. The children will get their education, grown-ups will get jobs, and paradise on earth has come to us.
What did you think about this at the time?
We were very happy because we did not realize what the future is going to bring us. We were happy that we got rid of the Germans, because from that, what we knew from 1933, we did expect the Jews are going to have hard times, but never in our wildest dreams that something like the Holocaust is going to happen. But on the other hand, we thought that the Soviet army is going to bring freedom. There won't be any more fear of wars. That maybe the rich part of the population is going to suffer in some degree, that their businesses are going to be taken away, they are going to be nationalized, was the right terminology for that. But that the proprietors will be employed in the businesses, I mean, being specialists in the field. The Russians would want them to run the businesses, and life is going to be normalized. The day the Red Army entered Białystok was the day of the eve of Yom Kippur, which is one of the famous Jewish day of holidays. And we consider that most probably that is going to be the most happy Yom Kippur in our lives.
What happened to your father being an industrialist?
In the beginning it turned out as we thought. The plant was nationalized, but they employed him as a specialist on a salary. And we thought that's how the thing is going to continue. But unfortunately, it turned out different. After about 6 weeks of the Russian liberation, we learned that gradually some of the former industrialists and merchants are being arrested. We couldn't comprehend why it happens. But officially the press was writing that they were elements undesirable for the state. And since Białystok was very close to the German border, being undesirable elements, they should be deported further east. And on the night of the 6th of November 1939, there came the knock on our door. Is Mr. David Flikier living here? Yes. Would you kindly take a few things with you? Some underwear, socks, soap, shaving gear, a towel. We take you away for a few days, but in a few days you will return to your family. These few days turned out to be 3.5 years. The first couple of weeks we used to take food parcels to the jail in Białystok, and they were accepted, so we knew that he must be there. But after 3 weeks, when the food parcels were knocked back, we knew that he is not anymore in Białystok. But we never had the slightest clue where he is, what he did wrong, with what he is accused, not the slightest idea. And within the next few weeks, quite a number of industrialists and merchants were arrested. We never knew what's going to happen to the rest of the family. But there is something that I have to point out, that the population, the Jewish population of Białystok, which before the war was 60,000, nearly doubled in these days. Tens of thousands of refugees that crossed the border from the other side that was under German occupation ran to the east, and we ran out of living space. We didn't have place where to accommodate the refugees. Every school building, every public building was occupied. every family gave some refuge for another family. But the Russians couldn't manage with food supplies. So they came out with propositions for the refugees. Whoever wants to go east, he is guaranteed to have some work and some reasonable living conditions. Actually, they didn't call it reasonable, they called it good living conditions. And a great number of the refugees signed up to live for work in the Soviet Union. But after about 2 or 3 weeks, a trickle started to return. And from them we learned what shocking conditions exist in the Soviet Union. Because the official propaganda was that it's heaven on earth, it's paradise for people. But the way the Red Army behaved, the way the Russian functionaries behaved, their ladies, how they started to clean out the shops of absolutely everything. I mean, it's only taken to put 2 and 2 together to realize that there must be very great shortages there. Because it was not a question of choosing particular items. It was whatever they could lay their hands on. And within a few weeks, the shops were empty of merchandise. No new goods came in. They locked up all the private shops. Bakers were supplied with some flour. Very small quantities of meat were available. The peasants were still bringing their produce to the market. But the Russians opened up some stores which were called universal stores, where some articles of food were available, some canned food, some canned fish, but very, very meager supplies. It's only thanks to the supplies that the peasants were bringing to the market we had enough food to survive. Forgetting about any clothing, we had to do with what we had. No clothing, no footwear, nothing of this nature was coming into the town.
When did you leave Białystok?
I leave Białystok, actually I can't say I left because we were deported. On the night from the 12th to the 13th of April 1940, 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on the door. We opened up the door. 2 KGB officers with a couple of soldiers that were brought to keep guard entered, asking if that's the family of David Flikier. After confirming that, they said, we're giving you half an hour to pack up. You are going to be resettled. On our questions, where to? The answer was, you'll find out. We were never told where we should go. And as it happens in life, a little bit of luck can change a whole picture. That happened in the case with our deportation, with our family. As a child, I asked one of the officers if I can go to the toilet. He said, yes. And going out from the room, in the passage where we had our hangers for the clothes, what do you call them? We have seen one of the guardsmen, one of the soldiers, standing next to a coat on the wall and having his hand in the pockets of the coat. Naturally, I realized that most probably he is looking for something. But when he has seen me, the colors in his face changed. I could see the fright in his face. And he said to me exactly these words: if you are not going to report to the officer what you have seen, I'll give you a very good tip. I mean, he used the Russian expression of the word tip. He said, take with you as much as possible clothing, because you are going to be deported to Siberia, where the climate is very, very cold, and where there are great shortages of food and clothing. And thanks to the things that you take with you, you might be able to survive. And I ran into the room and said, Mom, take as much clothing as you can. Don't be choosy, just grab anything, put it in. I mean, we didn't have any suitcases then. So you put some bed sheeting on the floor, filled it up with clothing, tied up the ends into a bundle. And my mother followed this advice, and we have taken a fair bit of clothing with us. We came down and a lorry was waiting on the street, loaded up with the clothing. Already another family was there that were picked up before us. We locked the doors. In the same building a brother of my mother lived. We gave him the keys. They were crying all around, but we said to him, don't worry, we are going to be very close from Białystok and we'll see you shortly. I mean, I didn't want to pass on to them the sad news that our journey is going to end in Siberia.
Why were you deported?
We were deported because we were the family of a socially undesirable person. And they called us socially undesirable element. In other words, we cannot live too close to the border. That was the official version. Unofficially, they wanted to get rid of us as soon as possible.
Did the same apply to wealthy or fairly wealthy Polish?
It applied the same, but there were not too many wealthy Polish. But the Polish families, they were families of public servants, of army personnel, of policemen. All these elements were considered socially undesirable. In other words, they did not trust them. And the families of these people were herded together with us. There were a few families of wealthy landowners, a few families of Polish merchants, but the majority were families of public servants, military personnel, or policemen.
Tell us about the transport to Siberia.
We were brought over to we used to call it cattle wagons, because in times of peace there were railway carriages that cattle was transported. It was on a side track on the railway station, not where the passenger trains are coming. And when we arrived, quite a number of families were already in these cattle trucks. We were unloaded to one of them. We finished up being 60 people in the cattle truck. absolutely no facilities at all. No toilet facilities. There were only 2 rows of porches, and each family had to take up a place there. When the wagon was filled up, the doors were locked. We could hear a click that they are not only shut, that they are locked. Soldiers with their rifles were walking around. A tremendous lot of crying. We didn't know how it's going to look. We didn't know what was to happen. The first job was to knock out a hole in the floor of the railway carriage that will serve as a toilet. The question of privacy was shocking. 2 people were holding a blanket when somebody used the facilities. And after 10 hours in the railway carriage, and in these 10 hours we were served once with some bread rations and some water, the wheel started rolling. And we started to move eastwards. It is very, very hard to describe the whole 16 days of this journey. The conditions were inhuman. 2 infants died because their mothers didn't have any milk to feed them with, and no milk was handed over by the guards. We survived thanks to the food that my mother, in her wisdom, has taken with her. And since we were deported before the Jewish Passover, we had the supply of matzah and some chicken fat. And that kept us alive for the 16 days. Through the whole 16 days we got hardly any food. 3 or 4 times we were handed out some bread rations and so-called soup, but the soup consisted of some hot water with a few pieces of cabbage leaves in them or a few fish bones. And if the journey would last another 3 or 4 days, I would think that at least half of us wouldn't survive it.
How do you know it was 16 days?
I mean, we know the day we left. We could see through the little window day or night. The doors used to be opened once a day. So we were keeping count of it.
We have to change the tape. The driver is Felix Flikier. Where did the train journey end?
The train journey ended in Siberia, in a little town called Pavlodar. That's where we were unloaded from the train on an open field. It was the 28th of April, which in these parts of the world it's still winter. The outside temperature must have been around -25, which is considered not very cold in these parts. And a welcome committee turned up of 2 officers of the KGB. They came over, and I must repeat their words of welcome. We brought you here to perish. We didn't bring you here to enjoy life. the ones of you that will be lucky and get used to the conditions of life here might survive. But as I said before, our aim is that you perish here. Shortly, some transport will turn up. You will be taken out to some villages where you have to adapt yourself to the conditions. You can imagine the feeling after such a welcome speech. Crying all around. We didn't have any men. There were only boys and women with children. Some started to talk, maybe it's worthwhile to jump on the railway tracks, to commit suicide, etc. But luckily nobody did it. Soon the sledges, which were drawn by oxen, bullocks, turned up. We loaded our possessions on the sledges and we started to move. The little village we were brought to was only 27 kilometers from the township, but it's taking about 5 hours journey. In the bitter cold, we tried to wrap around our bodies whatever was possible, but we were still freezing. They brought us over to a village that I would say it would more probably fit in the medieval times than in 1940. My description of it was such that since the whole of the Soviet Union was 50 years behind Europe, this village was 50 years behind the rest of the Soviet Union. It is very, very hard to describe what we found there. I'll only tell you that the conditions were the most primitive that you can imagine. The few huts were made of bricks, and the bricks were a mixture of cow manure and lime. The floors were also covered with this mixture. No furniture. Eventually, we were lucky that there was one communal hall. And this communal hall had already a wooden floor. I mean, it's hard to describe how lucky we were to finish off on this wooden floor at the first few nights. The local population that consisted mostly of Kazakhs. It's not the Cossacks, it's Kazakhs, which is a Mongolian race, very close to the Kyrgyz, to the Tajiks. They lived in all these primitive huts. No electricity, no water, heating, which was one of the most important parts because you could freeze to death if the place was not. The only fuel was dried cow's manure. Later on we learned how to collect it, how to store it, but the first few nights the local population brought over bits of it to the hall we were staying in. They were quiet people, seemed to be very nice, friendly, hardly spoke any Russian, and we did not understand a single word of their language. They came to the hall where we were unloaded. They sat on the floor and they looked at us the way we would look of some space travelers that would turn up in our midst. To them, we were some new breed. Some of the women used to come over and touch the material of the clothing, because the way they were dressed, it was something indescribable. Some of them, they were good-hearted, but they were so poor. But where they have seen a few children, they would bring a little bit of milk for the children. And for the rest of us, a bit of bread. For the night, some of them invited some families to their huts where they had a big, I think we called it cauldron, where they used to make some soup and offered it to us. We were naturally very, very grateful for that. But the shock the first few days was very, very hard to overcome. Suddenly, from a modern Western society, you are thrown into the most primitive conditions that could exist on earth. After 2 days in this communal hall, we were given a few of the huts. 3 families of our partners in the business, we were together, 10 people. We got one of these little primitive huts consisting of 1 room. And they gave us even 3 metal beds, iron, with some straw packed into sacks as a kind of mattress. You can imagine what it meant for 4 people to sleep in one of these narrow beds. I'll never forget when we had a letter from our family that was left behind, and they asked us, have you got a place where to put your heads at night? The answer was, it's not so bad with the heads, but with our legs. They had to hang up on the sides of the bed, couldn't fit it in. They organized us in working brigades. The most primitive type of work you can imagine, forming these bricks in winter. It was actually we would call it a cattle station. Very poor, very primitive. The cattle was thin, underfed, but they gave us the job to look after the cattle, to clean the barns. No food was given. The first loaf of bread we got 7 days after our arrival. But as I mentioned in my previous story, when we were deported, the men that told us, take as much as possible clothing with you. We realized what a blessing it was. Because for every little piece of clothing, the local population would barter it with us for food. That's what kept us alive.
What was the name of the village?
The name of the village was Čekat.
Please spell.
I'll try to spell it the best possible way. It would be T-C-Z-E-K-A-T, Čekat. The agricultural settlements in Russia were divided into 2 groups. There were the collective farms, where the group of peasants were the proprietors of the village. It was a cooperative. But there were also so-called sovkhoz, collectives that were run by the government, and the inhabitants were employed by the government. They did not own any land. Some of them had their cow, a few chickens, a pig occasionally, not very much in our place because the local population were Muslims. They did not use any pork. And the salary that was given, the wages, it was a laughing matter. You couldn't buy anything for it. The local population survived only from the tiny little plots that they had, with a bit of milk that they had from their cow. Occasionally, they would slaughter a sheep. Some of them had a few. But very, very meager. And we had it much worse than them. But with changing a piece of clothing, bartering for a piece of bread, a little bit of flour and that, we kept going. It was also very, very important to get some special felt boots for winter, because in this climate you cannot go outside in any type of leather boots. It must be the felt. And we bartered with the locals for some of these felt boots and some fur hats. That has been a must. The temperature in winter used to come down to minus 45 degrees outside. Inside the house, it was between minus 20 and minus 25, already after heating the place. I mean, it is something that is undescribable. A person must go through it, must live through it, to realize what it means. Our source of light was a tiny little bottle of eye drops with a little bit of kerosene that we could barter with the locals, and a flint made out of cotton wool. And by this light, a group of 10 people with one tiny little lamp had to live and cook and read and do everything. And in winter, the night lasts for about 16 to 18 hours. But you can adjust yourself and you can get used to any type of life where the circumstances force you to do it. The younger children were asked to attend school because, I mean, it's laughing, but schooling is compulsory. Feeding the people is not compulsory, but schooling is compulsory. And the closest school was 5 kilometers away, a tiny little village school. No transport, we had to walk to the school and return. And in winter, there were a couple of cases that some wolves attacked children. 2 children were killed and eaten up by the wolves. During the day, the grown-ups used to try to hunt, to find the wolves. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes not. But there was no alternative. We used to, from our particular village, 12 children were attending the school. We used to hold together, and when we could hear the howling of the wolves, we used to scream, frighten them away. But they were so hungry, the wolves too, that sometimes the screaming didn't help. And that's how life was going on under these primitive conditions. The temperature in winter used to reach minus 50. And it's hard to describe what happens to a human being when you go out at this temperature. Any part of the human body that's uncovered gets frostbitten immediately. We used to stay inside for water. We used to melt some snow that was plentiful around the house. And we used to wait till the temperature drops. I mean, when I say drops, to lower than 50, to 40, to 35. We lived under these conditions until the middle of 1941.
Describe the indoctrination that you might have been subject to at school. What did they teach you? What did they tell you?
It was the typical communist way of indoctrination. They were trying to convince us that we are the most happy people in the world, that we are not being exploited by the leeches, by the bloodsuckers, by the capitalists, that we live in a free society. It's like you tell a person that sits in jail that it's not a jail, it's a paradise, it's a holiday place. But they were going through the normal program of teaching, and that was in the program. Naturally, to us it was a laughing matter because we knew how normal life looks. But for the local population that was not used to anything else but to that what they had, they believed in it. They believed how free they are, how happy they are, how well fed, how well dressed. As it happened, the few of us were the top pupils at school, because the standard of this village school was very, very low. Most of us had a different type of education. So when it came to subjects like mathematics, geography, history, we were miles and miles above the local ones. They looked at us and they also thought we might be some beings from outer space. How do we know all these things? But then when the German-Russian war broke out in June 1941, things had taken on a different turn and started to change. And if you want to put any questions to me, Christian, please do.
Just before moving to that period, how did you stay in touch with world events?
We didn't know absolutely anything what goes on. We were cut off from the rest of the world. About the beginning of the war, we found out 3 days later when we went to the post office to pick up the mail, and we had to go, the post office was in the same village where the school. So where the mail was picked up, the postmaster told us that 3 days ago the Germans attacked the Soviet Union and the war has broken out.
How much of a surprise was this to you?
On one hand, we knew what a war means, how much unhappiness and tragedy it can bring. But on the other hand, we were hoping that maybe that will bring some change to our life, to our conditions. And later on, actually, that's what turned out.
And how realistic did you think the chances of the Germans were to actually conquer the Soviet Union?
After what we have seen of the German forces when they attacked Poland, and after what we have seen of the condition of the Red Army then when they entered our town of Białystok, we realized how far behind the Red Army is of the German forces. which has proven correct, because the German Blitzkrieg at the beginning of 1941, anyone that studied this period and knows something about it would realize how far the Germans were superior at this time. What saved the Soviet army and what brought them to victory is the Russian climate that was the downfall of Napoleon in 1812. It was the great massive help that the Soviet Union received from the Western countries, particularly from the United States and UK, the so-called Lend-Lease program, where billions and billions worth of merchandise, of food, of clothing, of ammunition, of metal products that are required for the production of planes, of artillery, of tanks. All thanks to that, the Red Army was able in time to modernize itself. And that brought the Red Army to a stage where they could start pushing out the Germans.
Back in Siberia, what language did you speak?
Between ourselves, we spoke Yiddish. With our Polish friends, they were together, we spoke Polish. And we learned Russian. And since we already knew the basics of Russian from the 6 months we lived in Białystok, it was easier for us to absorb the language. But with the local population, it was very little we could talk to, because their Russian was worse than ours. But when we used to come to school or the other village where the postmaster were, there were already more Russian families living in the villages. That also helped our barter trade. And I would say that knowing Polish, which is one of Slavic languages, it was easier for us to learn Russian. We could make ourselves understand, and we understood what the others are talking to us.
How many Jews and Poles were there in Czechad?
Czechad was actually divided into 3 little farms. It was farm number 1, farm number 2, farm number 3. We were on number 1. On our farm, there were about 16 families. There were the 3 Jewish families that we were together and 12 Polish families. I would say the 15 families consisted of about 45 people.
What dreams did you have while in Siberia? What kept you alive? What gave you hope?
Hope gave us, the dreams were that we will live to see a day. I'll talk about me personally. To see a day that I'll be able to sit down at a table where there is food on the table, and there is sufficient bread on the table that I'll be able to eat and eat and eat and still leave some bread uneaten. That was a dream. That we'll be able to read a book, because there was nothing absolutely in the village. There was the so-called club rooms, where once a week the population used to gather to sing a few communist songs. The only literature were booklets of the history of the Communist Party of the SSSR. And that was coming out our ears already. Nobody was in. But the dreams were they will live again under conditions where there is running water, there is electricity, there is a flushing toilet, that we'll have enough food, we'll have enough clothing, we'll be able to educate ourselves, we'll be able to travel, we'll be able to see the world. That kept us alive, these dreams of hope. I remember that I have taken with me, I had one book of detective stories. It was, like you buy every week a little booklet, and the story goes on from week to week until at the end it consisted of about 55 booklets. And I had it all bound into one book. And this book was going around the hands. After the last one finished, the first one started to read it again. All with the light of this tiny little lamp. Where the lamp was standing on the ceiling, you could see a big black patch from the soot coming out from the carol lamp. But I'll go back to the time when the war started and we started to build up our hopes. Maybe something will happen to us as well. And one day, I would say it must have been around the end of September 1941.
Before we go into that, we'll have to change the tape again.
Okay.
Tape 4, the survivor is Felix Flikier. Please continue.
A couple of KG men arrived to our village. They asked all the deportees to assemble in the hall, and they informed us that the Soviet Union made an agreement with the Polish government in exile in London, whereby all former Polish citizens are being released from the jails, from the deportation villages, a general amnesty for all the former Polish citizens. And as from now, we have got the right to leave the village, choose any other place of living, providing it's not against the local laws. And we can consider ourselves completely free people. We are not under any restrictions, we are not anymore criminal deportees. Naturally, we were filled up all with hope that that might be the beginning of the end. And I, with another representative of the three families of ours, we went over to this little township to see what are the chances to move over there. Because it would be for us a great step forward from a little rundown village to a township after all. And we were able to find a landlady that agreed to rent us 2 rooms and for a certain rent, and then we can come over. And that's what we did. We packed up, and on a couple of, it already was winter again, must have been the beginning of October 41. On 2 sledges, we arrived in this little township, settled down in the 2 rooms. It was a great step forward from that what we had before. In the township was a library, there was a movie theater, was a big marketplace where it was much easier to barter things, and life became much more bearable. Naturally, it was still far from the paradise promised by the Soviet government, but it was much better. From our father, we didn't know absolutely anything. Is he alive or not, and where he is? After writing to all the different governors of the provinces, and they call it the procureurs, which is, what would you call it? the opposite of defense prosecutors. But I never got a single reply from any one of them. I found myself a job in a small workshop that was making up the felt boots. It was a great blessing because I could get them at a lower price and being able to sell them on the market for better, exchange it for food, etc. It started to get slightly better. My younger brother and sister both attended school. And I don't know, Christian, if you would like, it's a very interesting case how we found my father. They started to turn up some former prisoners from the gulags that were liberated in conditions that are indescribable, in racks like skeletons and that. And one day a Polish man turned up in our township and a lady brought him to our house. Firstly, we fed him, then we gave him some hot water to wash himself, gave him a change of clothing, and then we started to ask him questions. Maybe by any chance he has been together or met somebody from the city of Białystok. And he said, as a matter of fact, on the same porch that I was lying in the camp, there was a man from Białystok by the name of David Flikier. Can you imagine what we felt? Now, and he said that was 3 months ago. Number one, we knew that he is alive. He gave us the address of the place. And to cut a long story short, we wrote a letter. The mail there is not exactly very fast, but it's taking about 4 months. We got a reply from our father that he's so happy to hear that we are alive. He didn't have a clue where we are where we left in Białystok or not. Anyway, after a few letters from him, we got a telegram that since I went through a medical commission and they found me unable to do any type of work, they released me from camp. And I am on my way to you. But don't worry if it takes a while, because you realize that the transport is not, it's taking 6 months. And in the beginning of 43, I don't remember the exact date, in the beginning of March 43, because I do remember that 2 weeks after his arrival, I volunteered to the army and was taken away. He turned up in our township. It's very hard to describe what happened, the feeling the whole family had. He was a man that when he was arrested, his weight was about 85 kilograms. He came back 35 kilograms. It was simply a skeleton covered with his skin. Naturally, we brought him, mother looked after him properly, and after a while he recovered his strength and put on a bit of weight. But 2 weeks after his arrival, my application to join the army came through, called me out, and I had to say goodbye to the whole family. And I started my army career.
In which gulag had your father been for all those years?
For all those years, he has been in a camp. For anyone that is familiar with the book of Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago. He was in a gulag by the name of Vorkuta, Vorkuta. It was very close to the Arctic Circle. And there were coal mines there, and he was working in a coal mine.
Please continue.
The stories he told us from the gulag It's also a subject for a separate book. But the happiness returned to the family, at least we were all together. I left for the army. In the beginning, I was a soldier of the Red Army. After a short training course, I was sent out on the front lines. I participated as a soldier in quite a few battles, and I continuously used to put applications to our commanders that as a former Polish citizen, please transfer me to the Polish armed forces. And one day I was called out to the office of the commander and said, your application was approved. You are being transferred to the Polish armed forces. Since you have proven yourself a capable soldier, you are assigned to a military academy, artillery school, where you'll graduate after a while and take up your position with the Polish armed forces. The military academy was in a town by the name of Riazan, R-I-A-Z-A-N. It was about 150 kilometers south of Moscow, and it was a very famous city for the military academies that were in this city. That must have been just the beginning of 44. As soon as the army started to get closer to the Polish borders, my military academy life was postponed for a while. I was drafted to the armed forces because they were short of personnel, and I already had the rank of a sergeant. Participated in a few battles, and that is when, on the 22nd of July 1944, my unit, which was the 44th Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment, participated in the liberation of the camp of Majdanek.
Before moving to that stage, let's go back a few months. Why did you join the Red Army, given what they had done to you and your family?
My idea was to be in the Polish units, but I realized that to be able to be transferred to a Polish unit, I must join first the ranks of the Red Army. My idea was I didn't care which army I joined as long as I have a chance to fight the Germans. Because I believed that only if the Germans will be beaten, there is a chance as a former army man I'll be able to take out my family from Siberia to bring them back to Poland. And as it happened, I was transferred to the Polish armed forces.
You mentioned the training you received south of Moscow. Tell us more about that training. How did it look like?
That was already the military academy. Considering the conditions in which the Soviet Union was at this time, that still was a time when the Germans were marching forward, where there were great shortages of everything in the country, the life at this academy was bearable. We got some reasonable uniforms, the food was reasonable, we got some very good military instructors which tried to fit in our brains what normally would take 2 years in 6 months, because there was no time to drag on the schooling for so long. Then after I liberated Majdanek, I was sent back to the military academy to continue my studies. But that was already in a Polish town by the name of Chelm, Chelm, which was very close to Lublin, where Majdanek was, about 80 kilometers.
Before Majdanek, the training that you received, what were you told about the strengths of the Germans? How were you trained to fight them?
That was already a time where they had to come out openly to explain the situation. And their way of thinking was such that since the Germans attacked us without any warning, the Red Army was at this stage not prepared to fight. But since already a few years nearly passed, we were able to build up the strength of our army, the tank corps, the artillery, the aviation, and with the help of the United States and other Western countries, our army now is a strong fighting force, and we hope that very soon we will conquer the German. And it was already at a time where the Germans started to be pushed out from the former Russian territories, and they were getting closer and closer to the former Polish border.
What did you know at the time about what was happening on the Western Front?
Very little. We used to get tidbits of information, just little bits. But I remember, I can't recollect the dates where the Allies had their victory in the African desert. And what the Russians started to, the line they've taken on to inform us, that in the beginning even the mighty Western powers were not prepared to fight the German army. But with passing of time they were able to reorganize also their armed forces. And now the trend is that the Germans are being hit from all sides. But they said we are waiting impatiently that the Western powers open up the second frontier. In other words, that they land their forces in some place in Europe to take off the great pressure that our forces are experiencing. And I'll come to that moment, but I finished the military academy on the 1st of January 1944. Yeah, wait a minute. I think I'm getting confused. 1st of January 1945. But I would like to come back for a while and to go back to the camp of Majdanek. We liberated the camp. What we learned there, it's indescribable. The memory of it makes me feel that I don't want to go back to it, even in memory. We found huge stocks of shoes, of clothing. In the crematoriums there were still some bones and ashes, and 150 prisoners that looked more like walking skeletons than human beings. Possible that some more were discovered later, but we stayed in the camp a very short time because we were actually a fighting unit, and the camp was taken over by special units of the KGB. It was their task to look after the liberated camps. There were a number of guards left behind in the Majdanek camp. Some of them were executed on the spot. Some of them were taken over by the military for further investigation and for some court cases. And I remember in December of 1944, I was called out to my commander in the military academy and asked, would I like to go over to Majdanek to participate in the execution of 6 former camp guards that were sentenced to be hanged. The feeling I had then, I said, I'll be only too happy to go over and witness it, or whatever I'll be asked to do, I will do. And that's how I found myself after a night's travel in a bitter cold day, December. And when we arrived in Majdanek, it was early in the morning. There were already a great number of military personnel from all different units that were assembled there to witness the execution of the 6 guards. When the sentence was read out that they are going to be executed by hanging, 6 utilities drove over to the scaffold. On each one of them, a prisoner was put on. The noose was put on the neck of the prisoner. And they were given their last word to say before the execution. Out of the 6, said that they are sorry what they did, but they had to do it because that was an order, they couldn't object to it, etc., etc. Only one of the 6 said that if he would have the choice, he would do the same thing again. And then they called out, are there any volunteers that would like to drive the utilities forward so they can drop and be hanged? And as many people were there, as many hands were lifted up. They only chose 6 to participate in the execution. I was not one of the 6. Any more questions, Christian? Or shall I continue?
When was the liberation of Majdanek?
The liberation of Majdanek was on the 22nd of July 1944.
Going back to that day, how had you been prepared for what you would see?
I have been not prepared at all, because we thought that might be a labor camp or something, but camps they were exterminating people, extermination camps. It didn't exist in our vocabulary. We didn't realize that anything like that could exist and still is. And Majdanek was our eye-opener. After Majdanek, we realized that what we are going to come across in the near future is going to be as shocking as that and maybe worse.
How did you cope with what you saw on that day?
Being a hardened army man, I cried on the quiet, but I realized that whatever happened, happened. I can't change things.
How aware were you that there were mostly Jews that were murdered there?
That's the guards told us. But as it happens in Majdanek, there was quite a number of Poles as well, and former Russian prisoners of war, and some gypsies. But the guards told that the majority of the prisoners were Jews.
How long did you stay in Majdanek?
About 6 hours.
Tell us about the infrastructure, the facilities you saw.
Look, it's hard to... It is certain facilities, even if they are not fit for animals, not only for human beings. There were the barracks where people lived like sardines in 18, one squeezed to the other. There were the crematoriums, there were the gas chambers. And the gas chambers looked exactly the way you read about it. Some huge cubicles, concrete walls, just one opening in the ceiling through which they used to drop the pellets of the Zyklon B, the poison gas. Some heavy doors that when they used to push in as many people as they could, they would seal the doors and start the gassing. And there were some, I don't remember how many, 3 or 4 crematorium ovens where they used to dispose of the bodies. But since the crematoriums could not cope with the number of corpses, they used to burn some on the open, and prisoners used to dig trenches, fill up the trenches with human bodies, cover it up.
Who told you this?
I was told by one of the prisoners that was a semi-skeleton that still was able to say and talk a few words. And after we gave him a little bit of food, and we had to be very careful with that, because some of them that got food and they started to fill themselves up with food, they were dying on the spot. He told me the story.
Did you walk into the gas chambers and you saw the crematorium?
Yes, I walked and saw the crematoriums and saw the bones and the ashes in the crematorium that were still left in the ovens, because they left Majdanek suddenly. They didn't have time to clean it up properly. They only, as many as possible prisoners that were able to travel, they've taken them out, marching them to the west. The ones that were left, they consider they are already gone as they'll, any moment they'll die, so it's not worth bothering with them.
What nationalities were the guards?
The guards were mostly Germans, but there were about 2 Ukrainians that used to collaborate with the Germans.
What were their ranks?
None of them had any. They all pulled off their ranks. They all looked like they played the part of ordinary soldiers. But I'm sure that some of them might have been in the officer rank. Later on, the KGB, after proper interrogations, found out, but in the beginning, the few hours that I spent there, we didn't know with whom we are dealing exactly.
Tell us more about the executions on that day.
The day when I was invited for the executions. No.
The day of the liberation.
It's unpleasant memories. But whoever listens to this testimony, I would like them to think for a moment what could have been the feeling of a 20-year-old that went through hell in Siberia and that, in the camps in Russia, and went through quite a few fights with the army, battle fight, and coming to a camp where you expect that it was a camp for labor, maybe hard conditions, and suddenly he discovered that it was a camp of extermination. Now, who knows, maybe his uncles or aunties or grandparents or nieces or nephews were gassed and cremated in this camp. Because while I was in the military school, I was in contact with Białystok and found out that not a single person of my family is alive. We don't know what happened to them. Later on it was discovered. So when we come to a camp like that, met people like walking skeletons, mounds of ashes and bones and thousands of pairs of shoes and glasses and clothing, and met the people, the perpetrators of these things. There was not much time of thinking. Executed them on the spot. It was not a time to think were they guilty or not guilty. They were there, they participated in the crimes, we eliminated them.
We have to change the tape. 5, the survivor is Felix Flikier.
You asked me the reaction of the liberated prisoners to the liberation. It's very hard to describe, Christian, because number one, they were in such a state that they could hardly show any reactions. The majority of them couldn't even stand up on their own feet. But the ones that could show some reaction, they were just crying like children. They were saying they just can't believe that is the end of all their sufferings. But only if you were able even to show that type of reaction.
You indicated that you didn't know about the Holocaust till Majdanek. What had you thought moving towards Poland about all the villages and towns you liberated and where the Jewish population was?
As it happened, Christian, this part of Poland that we liberated had not a very great Jewish population. The masses were more to the north and the west. But where we have been, we thought maybe the Germans resettled them somewhere. They'll start coming back. The local Polish population gave us very little information. The reason we found out later is that not all of them had their hands clean of Jewish blood. So they preferred not to talk about it. But we realized that something did happen, that some Jews were exterminated. But the scope of it, we couldn't even think about numbers and figures, what we found out later. But Majdanek was the first case where we familiarized ourselves with methods of planned massive extermination. Originally we thought maybe some units of the army, they were executing people, they were throwing them out of their homes, and that in some places ghettos were created, we learned already. But about the whole magnitude of the Holocaust, I didn't know until Majdanek I started to understand what happened.
What counseling, if any, did you receive after the liberation?
Christian, I didn't need any counseling. I can control myself. And whatever was sitting deep in my heart, the feelings, I didn't show it out, I didn't demonstrate it in any way. I didn't need any counseling.
What happened next?
After Majdanek, this execution I mentioned to you, in January I graduated. Immediately after the graduation, I was sent back to my former military unit. We started to go forward. In January the 12th, we liberated the second biggest Polish city, Lodz. And as it happened, at this stage of the war, there were just a few places where the Germans put up a great resistance. In most of the places we were just running, escaping. I can recollect Lodz was no battle at all for Lodz. We just marched in the city, and the destruction of Lodz was very minimal. The trams were running even the day we liberated the city. And in Lodz I came across 300 Jewish youngsters that survived the ghetto Lodz. I don't know the exact number of the Jewish population of Lodz, but it's definitely been in hundreds of thousands. Because Warsaw had over 300,000, so Lodz would have at least a third. 300 survived the ghetto Lodz. And our army unit, whatever could, and I personally, whatever I could to assist them in whichever way, I did. Mostly it was in some food rations and that. But again, we didn't stay too long in Lodz. The army had to march forward. The other big battle we had is for a Polish city called Poznań, P-O-Z-N-A-N. That was already close to the former German border. They had a big citadel there, where the Germans didn't give up easily, but eventually Poznań was liberated as well. And then we got the order to march south. And that is where we arrived to the city of Breslau. The Polish name for it was Wrocław, W-R-O-C-L-A-W. That is where we came across very, very hard fighting, because in Wrocław the Germans had quite a number of armaments factories plants, some of them underground. They were producing all famous types of rockets there. They didn't give it up easily. So very, very heavy battles were there. Especially our artillery unit was engaged day and night. And there, on the 23rd of March 1945, which is exactly 6 weeks before the end of the war, on a mission to the army headquarters, I was blown up on an anti-tank mine with my jeep. My driver was killed on the spot. I was thrown out from the jeep about 10 to 12 meters in the bushes. And thanks to these bushes and me being unconscious, I remained alive. Because it was found out later that in the middle of the night, the Germans came to the blown-up jeep to look for some foodstuff, drinks, cigarettes. They didn't find me. When I didn't turn up back to my unit in the morning, they found out that I've never turned up at the military headquarters. So they sent out a search unit and they found me in the bushes. I was brought over to a field hospital, and that is where the next stage of my life began.
How heavily were you injured?
I was very heavily injured, but only in the one left leg. It was a mass of broken bone and internal bleeding. When I was brought to the hospital, there were about over 300 people waiting their turn to be admitted. And as you can understand, we could not expect the same type of medical treatment that people are used these days. Everything was done in a hurry. But a very interesting thing happened to me. When I was brought into the operating table, and it was a Russian field hospital. Understanding Russian well, I could hear the conversation of the nurse with the surgeon. So I will give him his anesthetic soon, and we're going to amputate his left leg just behind the knee. And I don't know what came over me. I started to visualize myself hopping on one leg, how my life is going to be destroyed. And I lost control over myself, and they were standing the tray with all the instruments ready for the operation. And I pushed it all over, it fell on the floor with a big clang. And most probably that was my destiny. The head surgeon of this military unit of ours was visiting this hospital, and he came into the operating room. And since it was before anesthetic, I could hear every word spoken. And he asked the doctor, what happened here? I could hear some noises. Oh, he said, we got here a Polish officer. He needs amputation. And he's fighting. He doesn't want to let himself to be amputated. Let me have a look. Those were the words. He came over, he had a look at my wounded leg, and I remember the words he said. He said, we still got time with amputation. Let's put it in plaster and we'll see how it develops. That's how I saved my left leg. It was a matter of seconds. If I would be already under anesthetic, I would wake up without my left leg. In total, I spent 6 months in military hospitals. The end of the war in May, I celebrated still in a field hospital in Germany. But after that, they found that I am able to travel. And since I needed quite a few more months of hospitalization, they decided to send me east in a Red Cross sanitary train. Wherever we stopped in the big cities on the way east, they said, no vacancies in the hospital, go further, go further, go further. I finished off in the northern Caucasus, in a place called Yesentuki, J-E-S-E-N-T-U-K-I, which is now just close to the Republic of Chechnya, where all the battles have taken place. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth, fantastic climate. I arrived there, it must have been already June, or the end of May. Beautiful summer, no heat, a lot of greenery, flowers, trees. And I spent there June, July, August, September, October, 5 months. The end of October, I was called out that I have to be discharged. And I asked the director of the hospital, and where are you going to send me? So he's taking out a book with military regulations, whereby it said that soldiers and officers of foreign armies should be sent back to the republic of their country, to the capital of their country. And I said, in that case, you're going to send me to Warsaw. He said, that's what I have to do. I was still on 2 crutches. I could barely walk. So I said to him, you saved my life here and you're sending me that I'll perish otherwise. I have got a family in Siberia, they can take care of me. I want you to send me there. He said, it's beyond my control, I can't do it. So I said, who can? He said, I can organize a meeting for you with the military commander of Northern Caucasus, a general. He's the only one that can change this regulation. So he organized the meeting, I went there and explained to the general what happened. And I said, if I have to go to Warsaw, that'll be my end. I got nobody there, my whole family perished. I'm still on crutches, I'm partly helpless. He said, I can't do anything, but I can approach Moscow to find out. To cut it short, he got permission from Moscow. He gave the order that I can go back to my family in Siberia. And that's what happened. It was not an easy journey, full with different happenings, but I arrived to my family. It was November 1945. My mother was convinced that I have got only one leg. She didn't believe. So first thing, instead of kissing me, she tried out my left leg, if it's a wooden leg or a normal one, if it's a prosthesis. Anyway, we stayed there, and that's where I got my medal and order. I was the only officer of a foreign army in this little township, and they paid me all the respect. I felt really very important. By February 1946, about 4 months after my arrival, we were notified that in a matter of 2 weeks we are going to be evacuated back to Poland. Naturally, it's hard to describe the feeling of happiness we went through. They offered me, with one member of my family, to go back on a passenger train. But the others had to go back again on a cattle truck. But I said, whatever goes to happen to the rest of my family will happen to me. So they nominated me in charge of this particular transport. And naturally the return was slightly different than the way up. We were not locked up. We knew what awaits us ahead. We prepared some food, the proper clothing. And instead of crying, there were songs of happiness until we arrived in Poland. And our destination was not Białystok as we wanted to, but we were dispatched to Stettin, S-T-W-T-I-N. That's one of the cities that was transferred to Poland from the former German territories. There was a kind of exchange of territory. The Soviets got whatever they had before, they held on to it, so the Poles got back certain German territory which became part of Poland. Stettin was a port on the Baltic Sea. The living conditions in Stettin were definitely better than they would have been in Białystok, because Białystok was completely destroyed. In Stettin there was no battle for the city, only the facilities of the port were destroyed, the waterfront. So everybody got reasonably good flats to live. The Germans were deported back to Germany. I joined there a Zionist youth organization, and I still didn't have my discharge from the army, because when I was discharged from hospital, I got a 6 months leave. My discharge was due in April. My duty was in this youth organization to train the youngsters how to go on with rifles, with pistols, to learn them shooting, because the organization was already preparing youth for immigration to Palestine, it was then. And they knew that one day they'll have to learn to fight. That was one aspect. The other one, the attitude of the Polish population to the Jewish population was far from ideal. They couldn't understand how so many Jews still survived. For them, 200 or 300 were a great number of survivors. They were used that none should be. I stayed in Stettin till the 4th of July 1946.
In Stettin, what did it mean to you living in a house where maybe a former perpetrator had lived?
We didn't think about it. They were mostly flats belonging to the working class people. I mean, considering the conditions in Siberia, they were the most modern places to live, running water, toilets, electricity, all the facilities. But there were no luxury flats. And since we needed some place to live, so we didn't think about it who lived there before. We knew that we are not going to stay there very long. We already started to build some plans of migration.
And how was your attitude towards the Germans at the time?
I hated them. Deep in my heart, I hated all of them. But that's... Now my philosophy is different. You cannot call a whole nation that all of them are bad. You can say 95% are bad. But as long as there have been certain ones that showed some humane action, in my philosophy you cannot say the whole nation are bad. But at this time, to me, every German, the only good German was a dead German. But we had little to do with them. They were quickly evacuated back to Germany. And Stettin had a population of Poles. Some Russian military was stationed there. And a few hundred Jews that were brought over from the east, from the Siberian deportations. And as I said, on the 4th of July 1946, that was the day of the famous pogrom in the city of Kielce, where 47 Jews were killed, massacred, in the most sadistic and bestialic way by Polish masses. It was a blood libel. And
how was this event portrayed and reported in the media?
The media reported it truthfully, because it was already a time they couldn't hide it. It happened during the day, where thousands of witnesses were around. The only thing they tried to find some kind of excuse for it was maybe it was organized by the Secret Service as a provocation against the Polish government, but it was only, excuse me, bloody excuse. It was done by the Polish masses, not only civilians, but even some of the military and the police participated in it. And then I said to my family, my dears, in the next few days we are going to leave this land, never ever in my life I want to see Poland again. I forgot to mention that from Stettin we went once to Białystok for 7 days. We wanted to investigate if anybody of our family survived, and also what happened to our home, our house we had. We spent the months. We were able quickly to repossess our homes, sold it on the spot for peanuts, not even worth to mention the price. Whatever we got for our 2 beautiful houses and land, we had to pay key money here in 48 to rent a flat. But since my idea was to finish with Poland forever, so we did it. Anyway, we returned to Stettin, and on the 6th of July, 2 days after the Celts program, we escaped to Germany, to the occupied part. It was all occupied then. It was a great movement of Jews then to the west, because many, many felt that they don't want to live in Poland again.
Why?
What happened? The pogrom in Celts was only the big happening where 47 people got killed. But there were many, many instances where smaller numbers of Jews were murdered. In cases where some Jews turned up in little townships to find out if their houses are still exist, the local population wanted to get rid of them, that nobody can claim back their properties. There were some members of the Polish underground. In particular, there was one movement. It was a purely fascist Polish movement. They were called the National Armed Forces. And they were stopping trains, going through the trains, and wherever they met a Jew, they could find a Jewish face, they were taking them out from the train and executing on the spot. It was lawless. Jews felt they got no security and no hope of survival. And I was one of them. I didn't want. And in April, I forgot to mention, I was discharged from the army, honorable discharge. So we crossed the border with many, many tens of thousands of Jews that did the same. And I would say that the Polish and Russian governments, if they would want to stop us, they could have done it. But it was a kind of a shutting one eye. They don't see, they don't hear. And it was only a matter for the border guards to give them, there was not bribery money, some vodka, some sausage, few bottles of vodka, a couple of sausage was enough to let the transport through. We came to the American zone of Germany. We settled in a displaced persons camp by the name of Rachel, R-A-C-H-E-L, which was close to the big city of Kassel in the province of Hesse-Schlichtenau. Would you like, Christian, to know anything particular about the life in the DP camp?
Yes, but we'll do it after the change of the tape. Tape 6, the survivor is Felix Flikier. Tell us about life in the DP camp.
You know, everything is, when you compare it with something, you can get a better picture. Comparing with life in Siberia, it was paradise. Comparing with normal life like we live now, it was a reasonable, miserable existence. But we had a roof over our heads, we had freedom, we didn't starve, there were no luxuries, but we didn't starve. We were getting clothing from charitable organizations. And as a youngster, I had a chance to learn some kind of profession. And I joined some courses for dental technicians, where I spent more than a year to learn this trade. As it happened in the future, when I arrived in Australia, it was the abundance of dental technicians. In the camp we stayed till May 1948. It was just under 2 years. And we decided to migrate. Luckily, a former employee of my father, which was living in Melbourne, found our names on the list of the International Red Cross and found the address where we are. And the first thing he did is organize some landing permits for our family. So after receiving the landing permits, we moved to Paris, because from Paris, from Marseille, usually the boats were leaving for Australia. But it was a time where the migration was on a very large scale, and we had to sit in Paris nearly for 6 months until our turn came. In Paris, we were supported by the American Jewish Distribution Committee, that's a relief organization, which paid for our hotel and allocated them some amount of money for food. And after we went through the medical commission in the Australian Embassy, we started to plan our trip. And as it happened, at this time, as much as it's hard to believe, there was a certain quota for Jewish migrants. And it would take a long time for all of us to wait for a place on a boat. So the Jewish Joint Committee, what they did, they split the family. My brother and myself were put on a plane in Brussels on the Belgian airline Sabina. They got the idea to charter some planes to be able to bring over more people. So it was a miracle. In 6 days we arrived from Belgium to Melbourne, whereby my family traveled for 10 weeks on an old French troop carrier.
Tell us about that airplane voyage.
Actually, it was my first trip by plane, because you have to realize that we are talking about 50 years ago. The civil aviation was far from that what's these days. We traveled in a converted DC-9, which used to be an American troop carrier. There were 79 passengers, including a crew of 8, 71 and 8. To us it was a miracle. We only flew during the day. At night we landed and stayed on the ground. So I remember the first stop was on the Arabian Peninsula in Dubai. Then we came to, was it Bombay? Then it was Jakarta, which then it was still called Batavia. Darwin and Melbourne. When we arrived here, I can remember swarms of newspaper representatives, journalists, to tell them the story. They made photos of the group. I mean, it was only the second chartered plane that came to Australia with migrants. And then about our life after arrival, there is again, it's a very long story, but we felt very, very happy from the moment we arrived in this country. We could see that it's a country of freedom, a country of equality From the first day we came, we had the freedom and option to do whatever we liked to. Naturally, there were no social services then. There were no unemployment benefits. We had to find the pounds and shillings to buy our piece of bread and that. And we landed in Melbourne at 2 o'clock Saturday morning. At 5 o'clock Monday morning, my brother and myself were already on a truck that's taken out to the smog and midwork in Brooklyn, where we started our first job in Australia. And then from a few different jobs, we eventually started up a small delicatessen shop in Sydney Road, Brunswick. We branched out from one to another one. 12 to 14 hours a day were not too long working hours for us, 7 days a week. But we wanted to establish some kind of future. In the meantime, I managed to meet my wife. We fell in love. I married in 49. Our daughter was born in October 51. At this time I was with my family in the delicatessen and grocery business. We used to build up a business, sell it, buy another one, and slowly progressing. Eventually we gave up this type of business where we were all together. My brother branched out in one avenue in the textile business. I joined a cigarette distribution company where for 7 years that was my business. Actually, my business career lasted 21 years, 3 periods of 7. 7 years the grocery delicatessen, 7 years the cigarette and tobacco distribution, and then I formed with some partners a plastics company, plastic moldings. We started to produce the first plastic bottles in Melbourne. And actually my nickname was the king of the plastic bottles. It was a very hard battle because we had to fight against the established glassworks that were established for generations. And we had to convince the trade that plastic bottles are more suitable, they are cheaper, they take up less place, less weight, etc. In this business I spent 7 years as well, and due to failing health I retired at a very young age, 47. But it was not only the health problem. I decided that I have to enjoy a little bit my life, because except my childhood, which was very bright, my whole adult life was one hard battle for existence. Siberia, the army, the displaced camps, and then the hard battle to establish ourselves in Australia. So I did my mathematics, being not a very greedy person. I said to my wife, we'll somehow survive on that, what we have got. It's enough. I was never sorry for this decision. We traveled a lot around the world. We have been many times to Israel, where we got some close friends, very close ones. And also, in 1967, I established here, when it was the day the Six-Day War started in Israel. Being always a sympathizer and supporter of Israel, we tried to find a way how we can help them. And we established here an organization to help the Israeli disabled war veterans. And I started as a treasurer of this organization for 4 years. Then I became president, and for the next 26 years, I'm still president of this organization.
Is that what your button is about?
My button is an honorary member of the Israeli disabled war veterans. We did a tremendous lot of work for them. We collected funds. Being a apolitical organization, we are supported by the whole community. So when you are affiliated to some political movement, you are only supported by the people that are affiliated with you, but that is apolitical. And whenever I come to Israel to meet the members of this organization, we always get a VIP reception. And I met with all the leaders of Israel at the time, starting with Dayan, Peres, the chief of staff Raful, Begin. We established a place called Australia Center in one of the rest and rehabilitation places for the disabled. The place is called Bet Kay, Bethkay. That's in the north of Israel, Nahariya. And at the opening of it, the first secretary of the Australian embassy participated. And it's a beautiful place with a covered swimming pool, a heated one, with all the facilities, with offices, with a dining room and cafeteria, reading rooms, even a small tiny synagogue. And it's really a place where whoever comes from Australia to visit comes out with a very good impression. Australia became my and my family's country. I love the country. I loved it from the day I landed. And I would say to all the whingers that are not happy with Australia and with the Australian way of life, let them travel a bit overseas. They'll come back and kiss the ground. And I can honestly say that it's still the best place in the Western world to live. In spite of the problems we have got, comparing with other problems countries have, they are of very little importance. They are important to all of us, but on a world scale, they are not big problems. And my message to my daughter and my granddaughters would be, love and be loyal to the country where you were born. Fight for peace and freedom of people. Respect elders. Love your fellow men or women, fellow persons. Learn from the past and don't forget the past. Because only people who know and learn from the past know how to build their future. I finish with that, and Christian, I like to state again that comparing with the Holocaust survivors from the German concentration camps and that, our sufferings were not of the same scale. But for historical truth and for historical knowledge, I feel that future generations must also know about the type of Holocaust we went through and the tens of thousands of Jews that died in the Siberian steppes, in the gulags, where their bones are strewn all over the frozen country. Thank you, Christian, for giving me the opportunity for this statement.
Thank you very much. Who is this?
That's my paternal grandparents. My grandfather Mordko Flikier, my grandmother Feiga Flikier. And the photo is taken in 1935 in Białystok. My parents, Rebecca and David Flikier, photo taken in 1935 in Białystok.
How happy were your parents in Australia?
Very, very happy. We were all the family together, and in general we were a very close and happy family. My mother passed away in December 1968, my father in August 1977. Myself, the first on the right, my brother Harry, my sister Kayla, 1937, Białystok. The coats I and my brother are wearing, those are our winter school uniforms. That's the last family photo taken before the war in the spring of 1939. My father, mother, myself, my brother and my sister in a city garden of Białystok.
What was the occasion of this picture?
No particular occasion, just a family photo. My father David, photo taken in 1938.
Where?
In Białystok. My father David in the Russian Gulag in 1940, just 2 years later after the previous photo was taken. When we came to Melbourne, a journalist from The Sun has seen these two photos and offered me £200 to let them publish it. But for certain reasons I refused.
How much was £200? What
£200 was the equivalent of 30 weeks' salary.
Why did you refuse?
Because the person that brought us over here had some slight communist sympathies, and he didn't want that these two photos appear in the press. My wife Ursula and myself, March 1949 in Melbourne, the day we got engaged.
How has Ursula been able to support you, given your Holocaust experience?
What do you mean by supporting me?
What does she mean to you?
She means a great lot to me because Ursula lost her younger sister in the Holocaust. That left such a strong mark on her psyche that she devotes her life with study and support of the Holocaust victims. And she works regularly Mondays and Thursdays in the Melbourne Jewish Holocaust Center. All right? A photo of my family after our wedding, May 1949. Standing from the left, my mother, myself, my wife Ursula, my sister Kayla, my father David, and in the front, my brother Harry.
What was Jewish about your wedding?
It was a formal Jewish wedding in a small synagogue in Elwood. The same way what it happens now, but it was not such a posh ceremony. We simply couldn't afford then what people can afford these days. Another photo of my whole family taken in May 1954. Standing from left, myself, my wife Ursula, brother Harry, sister Kayla, brother-in-law Ted, my daughter Helen, 3 years old, father David, mother Rebecca, and nephew Leon Pruzansky.
Where is this picture taken?
It was taken in some kind of photographic studio in Melbourne. A photo of my immediate family, September 1995. Top left, my granddaughter Rachel, my son Paul, my granddaughter Rebecca, my daughter Helen, my wife Ursula, and myself.
What professions are your children engaged in?
They both of them study at Monash University. The younger Rachel, performing arts. Rebecca, law and economics. My son-in-law is the headmaster of the Mount Scopus Secondary School. My daughter Helen has got a PhD in maths, and she is doing some research work for La Trobe University. 1996, Melbourne. My daughter Helen at the graduation ceremony for her PhD. My granddaughter Rebecca to the left and Rachel to the right.
How often do you see your grandchildren?
At least once a week.
On what occasion?
Usually at Friday night family dinners.
Why is this important to you?
Because it is a tradition, very little to do with religion, but a tradition where the family meets once a week, have a meal together, can exchange ideas, whatever it is, spend time together. Me and my brother and sister, 1935, 50 years on, 1985, 55 years on, 1990, and 60 years on, 1995. My graduation certificate from the Military Academy, January 1945. I graduated as a lieutenant of artillery. An article in the newspaper USA Today from the 23rd of April 1993 about our participation at the opening of the USA Holocaust Museum.
How prominent is this day in your life?
It is a day in my life that I'll never forget, because it left a particular feeling that me, the man who lived through Siberia, and that have been about 10 meters away from the President of the United States, his good lady, senators, and that, and my right-hand neighbor was Senator Ted Kennedy. A photo of myself after the graduation from the Military Academy, the Order of the Red Star, the medals, from the left, for bravery, victory over Nazi Germany, liberation of Berlin, liberation of Warsaw, 50 years of victory over Nazi Germany, and 100 years of the birth of Marshal Zhukov, which was the commander of all the Russian military forces during World War II. And just a medal of a veteran of the Polish-Russian wars.
How is your own wartime injury today?
For 45 years I had a crook leg, but I didn't have the time to do anything about it. I was too busy to build a new life. After 45 years it started to hurt me very much. I was unable to walk any further anymore. So the decision was made that I'm going to operate, and I've been operated in Sydney in 1990, whereby the bones were broken and set again. My leg, instead of being curved 30 degrees, became straight and the normal length. And since then, I am feeling fantastic.
Looking back on your life experience and what you experienced in the Holocaust, is there a message for the world? How can we prevent a future Holocaust?
The message to the world is try to do everything possible to prevent a future Holocaust. It's not an easy job, but if we want to carry some responsibility for future generations, we have to do our hardest to achieve it.
Felix Flikier, thank you very much.
My pleasure.